The call button never lit up for room 237. In my 8 years as a registered nurse at Maplewood Manor, I'd learned to read the rhythm of the night shift like a familiar song. The soft wheeze of Mrs. Patterson's CPAP machine in 201. The restless shuffling of Mr. Kowalski, who wandered the halls searching for a bathroom that was always 3 doors to his left. The intermittent chime of call buttons, predictable as clockwork, summoning us for medications, bathroom assistance, or simply the comfort of human contact in the small hours. But room 237 remained silent. I'd been assigned to the West Wing for 3 months when they brought her in. The admission paperwork listed her as Margaret Thorne, age 83, with a diagnosis that made me pause: selective mutism with voluntary nutritional abstinence. In layman's terms, she chose not to speak or eat. The attending physician's notes were unusually brief, just standard vitals and a notation that she was stable for observation. My first night caring for Mrs. Thorne, I entered room 237 with the usual supplies: water pitcher, medication cup, and the gentle smile I'd perfected for residents who might be confused or frightened. She sat upright in the hospital bed, hands folded precisely in her lap, staring at the far wall. Her silver hair was combed straight back, and she wore a pale blue nightgown that looked freshly pressed despite her having arrived only hours earlier. "Good evening, Mrs. Thorne," I said, maintaining the professional warmth that had become second nature. "I'm Jessica, your nurse tonight. How are you feeling?" She didn't acknowledge my presence. Not a glance, not a twitch of recognition. I checked her chart again. No hearing impairment noted. I tried again, moving into her line of sight, but her gaze seemed to look through me entirely. The strangest part was her stillness. Most residents fidget, shift positions, show some sign of discomfort during long periods in bed. Mrs. Thorne remained motionless, her breathing so shallow I had to lean close to confirm she was alive. Her pulse, when I checked it, was steady and strong, surprisingly strong for someone her age who reportedly hadn't eaten in weeks. Over the following nights, I developed a routine with my silent patient. I'd enter at the beginning of my shift, attempt conversation, check her vitals, and document her refusal of food and medication. The documentation felt pointless. She never acknowledged the offerings, never showed signs of hunger or thirst. Yet somehow she appeared healthy. Her skin maintained good color, her eyes remained clear, and she showed no signs of dehydration or malnutrition. It was during my second week that I noticed the first anomaly. I'd finished my rounds and was catching up on charting when I realized I'd forgotten to check Mrs. Thorne's positioning. We were required to turn immobile patients every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. When I entered room 237, I stopped short. The bed was no longer against the east wall. It sat in the center of the room, angled so that Mrs. Thorne faced the doorway directly. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd somehow misremembered the room's layout. But no, I'd been in that room every night for 2 weeks. The bed had definitely been positioned against the wall. I made a mental note to ask the day shift if they'd moved it for cleaning or maintenance. The next evening, the bed was back in its original position. I asked Sandra, the day nurse, about it. "Move the bed? Honey, that woman hasn't so much as blinked since she got here. Why would we need to move anything?" I let it go, chalking it up to fatigue. Night shift plays tricks on your mind sometimes. Shadows become movement. Silence becomes whispers. But when I returned the following night, the bed was in the center of the room again. This time I made a point of observing Mrs. Thorne more carefully. She sat in exactly the same position, hands folded, gaze fixed on some invisible point. But now she was facing me, and for the first time I felt the weight of her attention. Not her eyes, she still looked past me, but something else. A presence that seemed to evaluate, to measure. I decided to test something. Before leaving her room that night, I made a small mark on the floor with my pen, a tiny dot that would show me the bed's exact position. When I returned for her midnight check, the bed had moved again. Not to the center this time, but rotated 90 degrees so she faced the window. The mark on the floor was a clear 6 inches from the bed's current position. My hands were shaking as I documented the incident, though I kept my notes clinical. Patient appears to have positional changes during night shift. Possible sleepwalking or staff intervention to be investigated, but I knew no staff had moved that bed. The medical equipment attached to the wall, oxygen outlets, suction units, hadn't been disturbed. The bed had simply relocated. The following night, I decided to stay in the room longer, charting at the small desk in the corner while pretending to work on other documentation. Mrs. Thorne remained motionless as always, but I noticed something I'd missed before. The air in the room felt different when the bed moved. Not a change in temperature, but in pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm. At 2:17 a.m., it happened while I was looking directly at her. The bed didn't slide or roll. It didn't make any sound. Between one heartbeat and the next, Mrs. Thorne was simply facing a different direction. The bed rotated 45 degrees clockwise. She hadn't moved. Her posture, her hand position, even the fold of her nightgown remained identical. But she was no longer facing the wall. She was facing me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mrs. Thorne's gaze, which had never seemed to focus on anything, was now locked directly on my eyes, not looking through me or past me, but into me. Her expression hadn't changed, the same serene blankness, but her eyes held a terrible awareness. I managed to stand, my chair scraping against the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. Mrs. Thorne didn't react to the noise, but her gaze followed me as I backed toward the door. Mrs. Thorne, my voice came out as barely a whisper. Can you hear me? For the first time since her admission, she moved, just her head tilting slightly to the left as if considering my question. The movement was fluid, deliberate, completely at odds with someone who'd been catatonic for weeks. Then she smiled. It wasn't a warm expression or a cruel one. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting patiently for a very long time and had finally received the recognition they deserved. The smile of someone who had always been watching, even when no one thought to watch back. I left the room and didn't return until the day shift arrived. When I gave report to Sandra, I kept my observations clinical, professional. I mentioned the bed positioning, the need for closer monitoring, possible signs of increased awareness. I didn't mention the smile or the way Mrs. Thorne's eyes had followed me, but as I drove home that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Not by Mrs. Thorne. She was miles away now, probably sitting in her bed with that same placid expression. The watching felt closer than that, more immediate, like someone sitting in the passenger seat of my car, observing my every move with patient, eternal interest. That night, when I returned to work, room 237 was empty. Mrs. Thorne had been discharged. Sandra informed me, picked up by family members during the day shift. No forwarding address, no follow-up appointments scheduled. The bed was back in its original position against the east wall, perfectly aligned with the outlets and equipment. There was no trace that anyone had ever been there, except for one small detail that I noticed as I was preparing the room for the next admission. On the wall opposite the bed, at eye level for someone sitting upright, someone had written a single word in pencil. So faint it was barely visible. Watching. I erased it immediately and never mentioned it in my documentation. But sometimes, during the quiet hours of the night shift, I find myself wondering about the other residents who never use their call buttons, who never seem to need anything, who sit patiently in their rooms with that same serene expression. I've started to notice that some of them move their heads to follow me as I pass their doorways, even when they're supposed to be sleeping. And I've begun to understand that in places like Maplewood Manor, not everyone who appears to need care is actually receiving it. Some of them might be providing it instead. The footsteps always started at 3:47 a.m. I'd been working the night shift as an orderly at Maplewood Manor for 6 years when I first heard them, a soft, shuffling gait that echoed from the north corridor. The sound was familiar in the way that all nursing home sounds become familiar. The particular rhythm of someone walking carefully, testing each step before committing their full weight. It was the walk of someone who had fallen before and remembered the lesson. My duties during the night shift were straightforward: respond to emergencies, assist nurses with lifting patients, and conduct hourly welfare checks on each wing. I knew the building's acoustic signature better than my own apartment, which rooms' floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, where the heating pipes rattled in the walls. The footsteps I heard that October night were new but not alarming. Residents wandered sometimes, especially those with dementia. Part of my job was gently redirecting them back to their rooms. I followed the sound down the north corridor, past the common area with its darkened television and arranged chairs, past the nursing station where Linda dozed over her crossword puzzle. The footsteps seemed to stay just ahead of me, maintaining the same measured pace. When I reached the end of the hallway, they stopped. The corridor terminated at a large window overlooking the courtyard. There was nowhere else to go, no rooms, no connecting hallways, no alcoves where someone could hide. I stood there for a moment, listening to the building's nighttime symphony of mechanical hums and distant snoring. No footsteps, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I chalked it up to the acoustics. Sound travels strangely in these old buildings, bouncing off tile floors and concrete walls, creating echoes that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. I'd probably heard someone walking in a different wing entirely, but the next night, at exactly 3:47 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time I was in the south wing, helping Mrs. Rodriguez back to bed after she'd gotten confused looking for the bathroom. The soft shuffling came from somewhere behind me, back toward the main corridor. I finished settling Mrs. Rodriguez and followed the sound, moving more quickly this time. I wanted to catch whoever it was before they became disoriented, or worse, fell. The footsteps led me through the same route, down the north corridor, past the common area, past the nursing station. Linda looked up as I passed. "Everything okay, Adam?" "Just checking on someone," I said, not wanting to explain that I was following sounds she apparently couldn't hear. Again, the footsteps stopped at the window. Again, I found nothing. On the third night, I decided to position myself at the end of the north corridor before 3:47 a.m. If someone was wandering down here regularly, I wanted to intercept them before they became confused or agitated. I brought a chair from the common area and settled in with a book, keeping one ear tuned for the familiar shuffling. At 3:47 a.m. exactly, the footsteps began, but this time they were coming from behind me. I turned around slowly, expecting to see a resident in a nightgown or pajamas, perhaps looking for a bathroom or trying to find their way back to their room. Instead, I saw Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell walking toward me with her characteristic careful gait, testing each step before committing her weight. Mrs. Hartwell had been one of my favorite residents. She'd been sharp as a tack despite her 89 years, always ready with a joke or a story about her late husband's fishing adventures. She never complained about her arthritis or the medications that made her drowsy, and she always thanked the staff for even the smallest kindnesses. Mrs. Hartwell had died 3 weeks ago. I'd been there when it happened. A quiet passing in her sleep, peaceful as anyone could hope for. I'd helped the funeral home staff remove her body, had attended her memorial service in the chapel, had even helped pack her belongings when her daughter came to collect them. But there she was, walking toward me in the pale nightgown she'd worn during her final weeks, her silver hair pinned back in the neat bun she'd favored. She looked exactly as she had in life, down to the slight tremor in her left hand and the way she favored her right hip. "Mrs. Hartwell." My voice came out as a croak. She stopped about 10 feet away and smiled, the same warm, genuine smile I remembered. Then she raised her right hand and beckoned to me, the gesture unmistakably clear. "Follow me." I couldn't move. Every rational part of my mind insisted that I was hallucinating, that the stress of night shift work and too much caffeine had finally caught up with me. But she looked so real, so solid, not translucent or glowing or any of the things you'd expect from a ghost story. Just Mrs. Hartwell, standing in the corridor where she used to take her evening walks before bedtime. When I didn't respond to her beckoning, her smile faded slightly. She gestured again, more urgently this time, and took a step toward me. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The clatter echoed through the corridor like gunshots. "Adam, what's going on?" Linda's voice called from the nursing station. I looked toward her voice for just a second, and when I turned back, Mrs. Hartwell was gone. Linda appeared at the far end of the corridor, flashlight in hand. "Are you okay?" "I heard a crash. I'm fine," I managed. Just knocked over a chair. She walked toward me, her flashlight beam sweeping the hallway. "Why are you sitting down here anyway?" I couldn't tell her the truth. Instead, I mumbled something about checking on strange noises and helped her carry the chair back to the common area. But as we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that familiar figure following behind us. The next night, I tried to ignore the footsteps when they started at 3:47 a.m. I stayed busy in the south wing, helping with a resident who'd become agitated and needed to be calmed down. But the shuffling sounds seemed to grow louder, more insistent. By 4:15 a.m., I couldn't stand it anymore. This time, Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for me in the common area, sitting in her favorite chair by the window, the one where she used to watch the sunrise while she waited for breakfast. She looked up when I entered, smiled, and beckoned again. "What do you want?" I whispered. She stood up slowly, the way she always had, taking care not to move too quickly and risk a dizzy spell. Then she walked toward the east wing, glancing back to make sure I was following, against every instinct screaming at me to run. I followed her. She led me down corridors I walked every night, past rooms I knew by heart. But somehow the familiar layout seemed different. The walls looked longer, the ceiling higher. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. Mrs. Hartwell's nightgown rustled softly as she walked, the only sound besides my own labored breathing. We stopped at room 247, Mrs. Hartwell's old room, which had been empty since her death. The door was closed, which was unusual. Empty rooms were typically left open for cleaning and maintenance. Mrs. Hartwell turned to face me and pointed at the door. Her expression was no longer gentle or welcoming. There was an urgency there, almost a desperation. She wanted me to go inside. "I can't," I said. "It's locked." She shook her head and pointed again, more insistently. Then she did something that made my blood freeze. She reached out and tried to touch my arm. Her fingers passed through me like cold air. That's when I finally understood what I was seeing. Not Mrs. Hartwell herself, but some impression she'd left behind. Some need so strong it had survived even death. She was trying to show me something, trying to communicate something important enough to keep her tethered to this place. With trembling hands, I tried the door handle. It turned easily. The room looked exactly as it had when Mrs. Hartwell was alive. Bed made with hospital corners, water pitcher on the nightstand, family photos arranged on the windowsill. But there was something wrong. The air smelled stale, unused, as if no one had been inside for months. Dust motes danced in the hallway light, spilling through the doorway. Mrs. Hartwell walked to the closet and pointed. Her mouth moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. She looked frustrated, angry even. She pointed at the closet again, then at me, then back at the closet. I opened the closet door. Inside, behind the few dresses that had been left behind, I found a loose baseboard. When I pulled it away, there was a small space carved into the wall, a hiding place that had been sealed behind the wood panel. Inside the space was a shoebox filled with letters tied with ribbon, and beneath the letters, a bundle of cash. The letters were addressed to various residents of Maplewood Manor, but they'd never been delivered. The return addresses showed they were from family members, children, grandchildren, siblings. Love letters, birthday wishes, Christmas cards, updates on grandchildren's achievements, all unopened, all stolen. The cash was substantial, thousands of dollars that had clearly been taken from residents over time. Social Security checks, birthday money from relatives, savings that elderly people often kept in cash because they didn't trust banks. Mrs. Hartwell had discovered someone was stealing from the residents, and she'd hidden the evidence. But she'd died before she could report it. I turned around to thank her, to tell her I understood, but she was gone. The room felt normal again, not the oppressive, dusty atmosphere I'd sensed moments before. Just an empty room with a terrible secret hidden in its walls. The investigation that followed my report led to the arrest of 2 day shift employees who'd been systematically stealing from residents for over 2 years. They'd taken mail to prevent family members from sending money, skimmed cash from Social Security checks, even stolen jewelry and small valuables from rooms. The scheme had been so carefully orchestrated that no one had noticed the pattern. I never saw Mrs. Hartwell again after that night. The footsteps at 3:47 a.m. stopped, and the north corridor returned to its normal nighttime quiet. But sometimes when I'm making my rounds, I catch a whiff of the lavender perfume she used to wear, or I'll find a chair positioned slightly differently than I remember, as if someone had been sitting there recently. I've come to understand that some residents never really leave Maplewood Manor. They become part of its fabric, woven into the routine of care and comfort that defines this place. And sometimes, when something threatens that routine, when the vulnerable are being harmed, they find ways to make their presence known. The night shift teaches you to notice things others miss, the subtle changes in routine, the sounds that don't belong, the shadows that move when they should be still. But it also teaches you that some observations can't be documented in incident reports or discussed in staff meetings. Some discoveries require a different kind of witness, one who understands that protection doesn't end with the final breath, and that justice sometimes walks the halls in slippered feet, testing each step before moving forward into the light. The file shouldn't have existed. I found it wedged behind a row of binders in the medical records office during my third week covering late shifts at Maplewood Manor. As the facility's consulting physician, I'd been reviewing patient charts to prepare for the morning rounds when I noticed the manila folder pressed against the back of the filing cabinet, nearly invisible in the gap between the metal frame and the wall. The tab read, Thornfield, Robert, RM312 in faded typewriter text. But room 312 had been converted to storage years ago, according to the facility administrator. I'd passed it dozens of times, always locked, marked with a maintenance-only sign that looked as permanent as the building's foundation. Robert Thornfield's medical record was thick, easily 3 times the size of typical resident files. The pages were yellowed and brittle, some typewritten on letterhead that predated the facility's current logo by decades. The earliest entries were dated 1987, which seemed impossible. Maplewood Manor had only been operating as a nursing facility since 1995. But what made me sit down and truly focus was the first clinical note: patient presence with complete physical stasis. No observable aging process detected. Cellular regeneration appears suspended at current state. Vital signs stable but anomalous. Recommend continued observation. The note was signed by Dr. Marcus Webb, whose name I recognized from the lobby's memorial plaque honoring former staff physicians. Dr. Webb had died in 2003. I flipped through the file, expecting to find some explanation, some context that would make sense of what I was reading. Instead, each page deepened the mystery. Monthly examination notes spanning decades, all documenting the same impossible finding. Robert Thornfield, admitted at age 34 in 1987, had not aged a single day. The vitals were meticulously recorded. Blood pressure consistently 120/80. Pulse exactly 72 beats per minute. Temperature 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Not approximately these numbers, exactly these numbers. Documented month after month, year after year, without the slightest variation. More disturbing were the tissue samples. Skin biopsies, blood work, even dental examinations, all showing cellular structures consistent with a healthy 34-year-old man. No signs of deterioration, no accumulated damage from environmental factors, no indication of the cellular breakdown that defines human aging. The photographs clipped to the inside cover showed a lean man with dark hair and unremarkable features. The images spanned nearly 4 decades, yet he looked identical in each one. Same hairline, same facial structure, same slight scar above his left eyebrow. Even his expression remained constant, a vacant, peaceful look that suggested deep sedation or profound mental absence. I checked my watch, 11:30 p.m. The facility was quiet except for the usual night sounds, ventilation systems, distant televisions, the soft conversations of night shift staff. I had time to review the file more thoroughly, though part of me wanted to return it to its hiding place and pretend I'd never found it. The psychological evaluations made for particularly unsettling reading. Multiple psychiatrists had examined Robert over the years, all reaching similar conclusions. The patient demonstrated no higher brain function, no response to stimuli, no indication of consciousness or awareness. Yet his body maintained perfect homeostasis without medical intervention. Subject appears to exist in a state of biological suspension, one report noted. All autonomic functions operate within normal parameters, but there is no evidence of cognitive processing, memory formation, or sensory integration. It is as if the patient's consciousness has been archived. The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. I found myself looking for patterns in the documentation, searching for some medical explanation that could account for Robert Thornfield's condition. The blood work showed perfect nutritional levels despite no record of feeding schedules. Muscle tone remained constant without physical therapy. Even his fingernails and hair maintained the same length, as if growth had simply stopped. The most recent entry was dated just 3 months ago. Written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Patient continues to show no signs of aging or deterioration. Cellular analysis indicates DNA remains in pristine condition with no accumulated damage. Telomeres show no shortening despite chronological age now exceeding 70 years. Recommend continued isolation and observation. Under no circumstances should patient be moved or disturbed. Isolation and observation. I looked up from the file, suddenly aware of how quiet the building had become. The usual night sounds seemed muted, as if the facility were holding its breath. I decided to walk past room 312. The maintenance corridor was dimly lit, fluorescent bulbs casting harsh shadows between pools of pale light. Room 312's door looked exactly as I'd always seen it. Industrial gray paint, brass nameplate removed, maintenance-only sign mounted at eye level. But now I noticed details I'd previously overlooked. The door frame was reinforced with additional metal brackets, and there were 3 separate locks instead of the standard single deadbolt. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. At first, nothing. Then, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, I heard breathing. Slow, regular, mechanical in its consistency, the rhythm of someone in deep sleep or sedation. My hands were shaking as I returned to the medical records office. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, needed to find some rational explanation for what the file suggested. I searched for related documents, cross-references, anything that might provide context. That's when I found the second file. This one was much thinner. Labeled, Facility Incident Reports, Confidential. Inside were documents dating back to Maplewood Manor's early years, most dealing with routine accidents and minor emergencies. But near the bottom of the stack, I found a report that made my blood freeze. Staff member discovered attempting unauthorized entry to restricted area. Subject claimed to have forgotten about patient in room 312. Medical evaluation revealed significant memory gaps consistent with selective amnesia. Recommend immediate transfer and full psychological debriefing. Under no circumstances should former employee be permitted to discuss observations with outside parties. The report was signed by the same Dr. Webb who had documented Robert Thornfield's condition, and it was dated 1998. But what terrified me was the subject's name. Dr. Emma Collins, my name, my exact name. I stared at the document until the letters seemed to blur and shift. It had to be a coincidence. Emma Collins wasn't an uncommon name, but the details were too specific, too personal. The report mentioned the subject's medical degree from Johns Hopkins, her residency at Massachusetts General, even her birth date. My birth date. According to the file, I had worked at Maplewood Manor 15 years before I was born. I closed the files and sat in the darkness, trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. There had to be a logical explanation. Falsified documents, perhaps. Someone's idea of an elaborate prank. But the papers felt genuine. The right weight, the correct aging. Official seals and signatures that would be impossible to fake convincingly. When I looked up, someone was standing in the doorway. It was a man I didn't recognize, wearing scrubs that looked decades out of date. His face was kind but tired, with the expression of someone who had carried heavy secrets for too long. Dr. Collins, he said quietly, I was wondering when you'd find those files again. Again? He stepped into the room, and I noticed his name tag, Dr. Marcus Webb. The same Dr. Webb whose signature appeared throughout Robert Thornfield's medical record. The same Dr. Webb who had died 20 years ago. You always find them, he continued. Every time you start working here, you discover Robert's file within a few weeks. You read the reports, you investigate the room, and then... He paused, looking genuinely sad. Then we have to help you forget again. That's impossible. I've never worked here before. Dr. Webb pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. Check your personnel file, Emma. Look at your application date. Look at your references. With trembling hands, I opened the filing cabinet's personnel drawer and found my own employment record. The hire date was listed as September 15th, 1997. My references included physicians I'd never met, from hospitals where I'd never worked. But I remember my residency, I said. I remember medical school, my childhood, everything. Of course you do. We're very careful about maintaining continuity, but some memories have to be edited for everyone's safety, including yours. The room seemed to be spinning around me. Why? What's really happening here? Dr. Webb gestured toward Robert Thornfield's file. Some medical anomalies can't be studied through conventional means. They require long-term observation, careful documentation, and most importantly, containment. Robert isn't our only patient of this type, though he's certainly the most stable. What type? The type that challenges our understanding of human biology so fundamentally that the knowledge itself becomes dangerous. The type that certain government agencies have decided should remain classified until we better understand the implications. I thought about the breathing I'd heard behind room 312's door, the perfect vital signs documented month after month, the photographs showing a man who hadn't aged in nearly 4 decades. How many times have I discovered this? I asked. This is your 7th rotation. You're remarkably consistent. Always find the file within 3 weeks. Always investigate the same way. Always reach the same conclusions. It's actually quite helpful for our research. And after this conversation, Dr. Webb looked genuinely regretful. You'll wake up tomorrow morning in your apartment, ready for another day at your new job. You'll remember your medical training, your personal history, everything that makes you who you are. You just won't remember Robert Thornfield or the questions that led you to his file. Until I find it again. Until you find it again. I stood up, though my legs felt unsteady. What if I refuse? What if I try to leave, try to report what I've learned? Then you'll discover that some doors only open inward, and some jobs are more permanent than they initially appear. As if to demonstrate his point, I heard the soft click of locks engaging throughout the building. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, the electronic security system activating, sealing all exits until morning. Dr. Webb stood as well, his expression sympathetic but firm. Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow you'll start fresh with new questions to ask and new discoveries to make. And eventually you'll find Robert's file again, just like you always do. He walked toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You're a good physician, and you deserve better than this. But some knowledge requires guardians, and some guardians never truly leave their posts. After he left, I sat alone in the medical records office, surrounded by files that documented impossible things. I tried to hold on to the details, to memorize everything I'd learned. But already the edges of my thoughts were becoming fuzzy, indistinct. By morning I knew I would remember nothing of this night except the vague satisfaction of completing my patient reviews. I would walk past room 312 without curiosity, would file my reports without noticing any gaps in the documentation. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a seed of questions would remain, growing slowly until it drove me once again to search for answers in places where answers were never meant to be found. Some records, I realized as consciousness began to fade, are designed to be discovered repeatedly, each reading a performance in an endless cycle of revelation and forgetting, and some positions in medicine require practitioners who never truly remember how long they've been practicing at all. The bell first started ringing on a Tuesday in October, at exactly 2:30 a.m. I'd been working security at Maplewood Manor for 4 years, and I knew every sound the building made during its quiet hours. The hum of the heating system cycling on at 1:15. Mrs. Patterson's coughing fits that came like clockwork around 3:00. The soft ding of the elevator when someone pressed the call button, usually followed by the shuffle of slippers as night staff moved between floors. But this bell was different. It had the clear brass tone of an old-fashioned service bell, the kind you'd ring to summon a waiter or call for assistance. Single chime, lasting about 3 seconds, echoing through the corridors with a resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The first night I heard it, I did a complete sweep of the facility. Checked every room, every hallway, every common area. I examined the nurse call system, tested all the emergency buttons, even looked at the small bells some residents kept on their nightstands for attracting attention. Nothing. No source, no explanation, and none of the staff had heard anything unusual. The second night, I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the central corridor with a notepad and my radio, determined to pinpoint the bell's location. At 2:30 a.m. exactly, it rang again. Single chime, clear as crystal, seeming to originate from the south wing. I moved quickly in that direction. But by the time I reached the nurse's station, the echo had faded, leaving only the building's normal nighttime ambience. Linda, the night nurse, looked up from her charts. Everything okay, Mike? Did you hear that bell? She paused, pen suspended over her paperwork. What bell? The service bell. Just rang about 30 seconds ago. Linda shook her head. I didn't hear anything. Are you feeling all right? You look a little stressed. I was stressed, but not in any way I could explain to Linda. The bell was loud, clear, unmistakable, yet somehow I seemed to be the only person who could hear it. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine around the bell. Each night at 2:25, I'd position myself in a different location, trying to triangulate its source through careful observation. The sound seemed to move, sometimes from the south wing, sometimes from the east, occasionally from areas of the building I knew were locked and empty. I started keeping detailed logs, mapping the bell's apparent location each night. A pattern began to emerge, though not one that made any rational sense. The bell was moving through the building following the old floor plans, the original layout from when Maplewood Manor had been constructed in 1952 as a private psychiatric hospital. I'd found the original blueprints in the facility administrator's office, filed away with other historical documents. The building had been extensively renovated in the 1990s when it was converted to a nursing home. Walls had been moved, rooms reconfigured, entire sections redesigned to meet modern accessibility requirements. But the bell seemed to be following the old patterns, ringing from rooms that no longer existed in their original form. The revelation that bothered me most was room 237B. According to the 1952 blueprints, room 237B had been located in what was now a janitor's closet. The space had been subdivided during renovation, with most of the original room converted to utility space and a small section incorporated into the current room 237. But for 3 consecutive nights, the bell seemed to ring from exactly where 237B would have been. I decided to investigate the closet. The door was kept locked, but I had master keys as part of my security duties. Inside, I found the usual cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, but something felt off about the proportions. The closet seemed smaller than it should be, given the space available. I measured the interior dimensions and compared them to the exterior walls. There was a 3-foot gap. Behind a shelf of industrial cleaning products, I found a section of drywall that sounded hollow when tapped. The seam was nearly invisible, painted over multiple times, but with careful examination, I could see where a door had been sealed up. Someone had walled off part of the original room, creating a hidden space within the building's structure. I should have reported my discovery to the facility administrator. Should have followed proper procedures and let maintenance investigate. Instead, I found myself returning to the supply closet night after night, staring at that concealed wall and wondering what lay behind it. The bell was ringing from inside there. I was certain of it. On a Thursday night in November, exactly 6 weeks after the bell had first chimed, I brought tools from my garage at home. A small crowbar, a flashlight, and a reciprocating saw I'd borrowed from my brother-in-law.
If anyone questioned my presence in the supply closet,
I'd claimed to be investigating a possible water leak or electrical issue. The drywall came away easier than expected, revealing a narrow door frame that had been filled with insulation and sealed. Behind the insulation was a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate that read 237B in the same font used throughout the original hospital. The door was unlocked. The room beyond was frozen in time. Original hospital furniture from the 1950s, a metal bed frame, a small wooden desk, a chair positioned by a tall window that looked out onto the courtyard. The air smelled of old disinfectant and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. On the desk sat a brass service bell, polished to a mirror shine despite decades of abandonment. I approached it carefully, my flashlight beam revealing details that made my skin crawl. The bell showed signs of recent use, fingerprints on the brass surface, worn spots where it had been grasped repeatedly. But that was impossible. This room had been sealed for decades. Next to the bell was a patient file, thick with documentation spanning several years in the early 1950s. The name on the tab was Margaret Thorne, and as I opened it, I realized I recognized the case from somewhere, though I couldn't place where. Margaret had been committed to the psychiatric hospital at age 31, diagnosed with what the records called severe melancholic episodes with violent tendencies. The treatment notes made for disturbing reading, prolonged isolation, experimental medications, procedures that would be considered torture by modern standards. But what caught my attention were the incident reports. Margaret had repeatedly attempted to signal for help using the room's service bell, ringing it at all hours despite staff orders to remain quiet during treatment sessions. The bell had been removed from her room multiple times, only to reappear somehow, always resuming its chiming at 2:30 a.m. Patient continues to ring bell despite repeated confiscation of device, one report noted. Source of replacement bells unknown. Recommend permanent removal of call system from room. 237B, the final entry in Margaret's file, was a death certificate dated December 15, 1953. Cause of death was listed as cardiac failure during routine treatment, but a handwritten note in the margin suggested something more sinister. Patient found deceased at 2:30 a.m. Service bell discovered in room despite previous removal. Investigation pending. There was no record of any investigation. I set the file down and examined the bell more closely. It was identical to the ones described in Margaret's medical records. Heavy brass with a wooden handle, engraved with the hospital's original name. When I picked it up, it felt warm to the touch, as if someone had been handling it recently. That's when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. I switched off my flashlight and listened. Soft, shuffling steps moving slowly down the hallway. They stopped just outside the supply closet, and I heard the door handle turn. "Mike, are you in there?" It was Linda's voice, but something was wrong with it. The tone was too flat, too emotionless. Linda always spoke with warmth and concern, especially when addressing potential problems. "I'm fine," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just checking on some maintenance issues." "You need to come out now, Mike. It's not safe in there." I moved quietly to the hidden door frame and peered out into the supply closet. Linda was standing in the doorway, but she looked wrong. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too wide, and she was wearing a nurse's uniform from decades past. The old-fashioned white dress and cap that hadn't been standard hospital attire since the 1960s. "Linda," I whispered. She smiled, but the expression was all wrong. Too wide, too knowing. Margaret's been waiting a long time for someone to hear her bell. "She's so grateful you finally answered." Behind Linda, I could see other figures in the corridor. Patients in hospital gowns from the 1950s. Staff members in outdated uniforms, all of them standing perfectly still, all of them smiling that same unsettling smile. "She just wants to thank you," Linda continued, "for listening, for caring enough to investigate. Won't you come out and meet her?" I looked back at the bell in my hand, understanding finally dawning. Margaret Thorne hadn't died in 1953. She'd been calling for help every night since then, ringing her bell at 2:30 a.m., the exact time she'd passed away. And now that someone had finally answered her call, she wanted to ensure they stayed to hear the rest of her story. The figures in the corridor began to move closer, their outdated clothing rustling softly as they approached the supply closet. I could see Margaret herself now, standing behind the others, a young woman in a hospital gown, holding an identical brass bell in her pale hands. She raised the bell and rang it once. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, resonating not just through the air, but through my bones, my teeth, my very soul. It was the sound of decades of unanswered calls for help, of isolation and desperation, of pain that had never been properly acknowledged or addressed. And I realized, as the sound faded and the figures pressed closer, that some bells can never be unrung. Some calls for help create obligations that transcend death, binding the listener to the caller in ways that employment contracts never specify. The last thing I remember clearly was Margaret's grateful smile as she reached out to touch my hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. I woke up the next morning in the security office, slumped over my desk with no memory of how I'd gotten there. According to my logbook, I'd completed all my rounds as scheduled, with no incidents to report. But I found tools in my locker that didn't belong to me, and there was plaster dust under my fingernails. The supply closet had been cleaned and reorganized, with no sign that it had ever been disturbed. But sometimes during my rounds I catch glimpses of that brass bell sitting on shelves where it shouldn't be, waiting patiently for the next person who might be curious enough to investigate its nightly chiming. The bell still rings at 2:30 a.m., but now I understand it's not a call for help. It's a thank you note, a gesture of appreciation from someone who waited 70 years for acknowledgement. And sometimes, when the night is particularly quiet, I hear other bells beginning to ring from different parts of the building. Patient call systems that were removed decades ago. Service bells from rooms that no longer exist. Each one represents someone else who died waiting for help that never came. Someone else whose final moments were spent reaching for a bell that no one bothered to answer. I've learned that security work in places like Maplewood Manor involves more than protecting the living. Sometimes you're called upon to provide comfort to those who've been waiting far longer than any reasonable person should have to wait. And once you've answered that kind of call, you become part of the system that ensures no one else has to ring alone in the darkness, hoping someone will finally hear their desperate plea for acknowledgement. I first noticed the shadow didn't match on a Wednesday night in March, during my 7th month at Maplewood Manor. The hallway mirror was positioned at the intersection of the east and west wings, strategically placed so that nursing staff could observe both corridors without leaving their station. It was a practical fixture, nothing decorative about it, just a large rectangular mirror in a plain metal frame, mounted to help with sight lines and monitoring resident movement. I'd passed that mirror hundreds of times during my shifts, usually focused on patient needs or medication schedules. But that Wednesday night, something made me pause and actually look at my reflection. I was there, as expected. Rachel Jenkins, 28 years old, brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, wearing the familiar blue scrubs that marked me as a registered nurse. But behind my reflection, slightly to the left and partially obscured by my own image, was another figure, a shadow that looked like me but wasn't me. At first glance, it appeared to be a trick of the lighting. The hallway's fluorescent fixtures were old and prone to creating strange shadows, especially late at night when half the bulbs were dimmed to avoid disturbing residents' sleep. But as I shifted my position, testing the play of light and shadow, the figure remained constant. The shadow Rachel was wearing different clothes, a white dress that looked like a nurse's uniform from decades past. Her hair was styled differently too, victory rolls that belonged to the 1940s rather than the simple ponytail I always wore for work. Most unsettling of all, she appeared to be interacting with people I couldn't see, turning her head to address invisible patients, making notes on a clipboard that wasn't there. I stepped closer to the mirror, trying to understand what I was seeing. My reflection moved normally, mimicking my actions perfectly. But the shadow figure continued her own routine, as if she were working a shift in some parallel version of Maplewood Manor that existed only in the mirror's surface. "Everything okay, Rachel?" I turned to find Dr. Collins approaching from the west wing, chart in hand. She looked tired, which wasn't unusual for the late shift, but her expression showed genuine concern. "Did you see that?" I pointed at the mirror. Dr. Collins glanced at it, then back at me. "See what?" I looked again. Just my own reflection now, standing in an empty hallway. No shadow figure, no vintage uniform, no invisible patients receiving care from a nurse who existed only in the mirror's memory. "Nothing," I said. "Just thought I saw. Never mind. Long shift." Dr. Collins nodded sympathetically. "These old buildings play tricks on your eyes. All those years of artificial lighting and institutional paint. Get some rest when you can." But I couldn't rest. For the remainder of my shift, I found myself drawn back to that mirror, checking for the shadow figure who had seemed so real, so purposeful in her work. Each time I saw only my normal reflection, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind the glass. The next night, I positioned myself at the nurse's station with a clear view of the mirror, pretending to work on documentation while actually observing the reflection. For 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. Then, at exactly 3:20 a.m., she appeared. This time, the shadow Rachel was pushing a medication cart that looked nothing like our modern equipment. It was smaller, more ornate, with glass bottles instead of plastic containers. She moved with purpose and familiarity, stopping at specific points in the hallway that corresponded to room locations, though she seemed to be visiting rooms that didn't exist in our current layout. I grabbed a facility blueprint from the administrative files and compared it to what I was seeing. The shadow figure was making rounds according to the building's original design, back when it had been Mercy General Hospital in the 1940s. She was visiting rooms that had been subdivided or repurposed during the conversion to a nursing home, caring for patients who had been gone for decades. But what disturbed me most was how familiar her movements looked. The way she held her head when concentrating, the slight favor of her left leg, the unconscious habit of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. All of it was unmistakably me. but in a time and place where I had never existed. Over the following weeks, I began documenting the shadow figure's appearances. She maintained a consistent schedule, manifesting between 3:20 and 4:15 a.m., always dressed in the same vintage uniform, always following the same routine. But gradually she began to notice me watching. It started subtly. A slight turn of her head toward the mirror's surface, as if she sensed someone observing her. Then more direct acknowledgement, full eye contact with my reflection, a small wave of greeting. Eventually what appeared to be attempts at communication. The shadow Rachel would mouth words I couldn't hear, gesturing toward areas of the building that were now storage rooms or utility spaces. She seemed frustrated by my inability to understand her, and her attempts to communicate became more urgent, more desperate. One night, she held up a piece of paper to the mirror's surface. I could see writing on it, but the text was reversed and faded, barely legible even when I pressed close to the glass. I managed to make out a few words: help, room, and what looked like Margaret. Margaret. The name was familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it. I searched through current resident files, but we had no Margaret at Maplewood Manor. However, when I accessed the historical records, I found multiple Margarets who had been patients at Mercy General Hospital during its psychiatric care years. One file stood out: Margaret Thorne, admitted in 1952 for treatment of severe depression. The photograph clipped to her intake form showed a young woman with kind eyes and a sad smile, but what caught my attention was the attending nurse listed in her treatment notes: Rachel Morrison. The name was different, but when I found the personnel photograph in the historical archives, I nearly dropped the file. Rachel Morrison looked exactly like me. Not similar, not vaguely reminiscent. Identical. Same face, same hair color, same slight asymmetry in the eyebrows that I'd inherited from my mother. According to her employment record, Rachel Morrison had worked at Mercy General from 1941 to 1953, when she died in a car accident while driving home from a night shift. She'd been 28 years old, the same age I was now. The more I researched Rachel Morrison, the more disturbing the parallels became. She'd grown up in Ohio, just like me, had attended nursing school on a scholarship, just like me, had taken a position at Mercy General because she believed in caring for society's most vulnerable patients, the same reason I'd chosen to work in geriatric care. But the similarities went beyond career choices and background. Rachel Morrison's handwriting, preserved in patient notes and incident reports, was virtually identical to mine. Her signature looked like something I might have written myself. Even her documented personality traits, compassionate but strong-willed, detail-oriented, occasionally impatient with inefficient procedures, matched my own professional evaluations. It was as if I were living some sort of predetermined script, following a path that had already been walked by someone who looked exactly like me, in the same building, doing the same job. The shadow Rachel's appearances became more frequent and more interactive. She would point to specific locations in the mirror, then gesture toward the physical hallway, as if trying to direct my attention to something important. Following her guidance, I discovered maintenance issues that hadn't been reported: loose handrails, burned-out emergency lighting, potential trip hazards that could injure elderly residents. It was helpful, but also deeply unsettling. The shadow figure seemed to know the building better than I did, aware of problems that weren't visible during regular inspections. She was providing care and protection that extended beyond her own time, looking after residents who existed decades after her death. But her attention gradually shifted from general facility issues to something more specific, more personal. She began pointing consistently toward the same area, a section of the East Wing that had been converted from patient rooms to administrative offices. Following her guidance, I found myself in what had once been room 237B, according to the original blueprints. The space was now used for medical records storage, filing cabinets filling what had been a patient room. But behind one of the cabinets, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the wall, barely visible but unmistakably there, were the words: Rachel Morrison, night shift. Remember Margaret. Below the inscription was a date: March 15th, 1953, 3 days before Rachel Morrison's fatal car accident. That night, when the shadow figure appeared in the mirror, I was ready with questions. I mouthed words clearly: hoping she could read my lips. What happened to Margaret? The shadow Rachel's expression became urgent, desperate. She pointed toward the storage room, then held up her hands with all 10 fingers extended. 10 times. Then she made a gesture across her throat, the universal sign for death. 10 deaths. Margaret and 9 others. I spent the rest of the week researching patient records from 1953, focusing on deaths that had occurred around the time of Rachel Morrison's accident. What I found was a pattern of suspicious fatalities, 10 patients who had died within a 2-week period, all from complications related to their psychiatric treatments. The deaths had been investigated by hospital administration but ruled accidental or due to natural causes. However, Rachel Morrison's personal notes, preserved in the historical files, told a different story. She had documented concerns about a particular staff member who was administering unauthorized treatments, conducting what appeared to be unsanctioned experiments on vulnerable patients. Margaret Thorne had been one of those patients. Rachel Morrison had been preparing to report her findings to state authorities when she died in that car accident. An accident that, according to police reports, occurred when her vehicle inexplicably veered off a straight road on a clear night, suggesting mechanical failure or driver impairment that was never adequately explained. The shadow Rachel's desperate attempts at communication suddenly made sense. She had died before she could protect those patients, before she could expose the truth about what was happening at Mercy General. And somehow, through the mirror that had witnessed decades of hospital life, she was still trying to complete her final case, still trying to ensure that Margaret Thorne and the others received the justice they deserved. That night, I brought the historical files to the mirror and held them up so the shadow Rachel could see them. Her expression changed from desperation to relief, then to something that looked like gratitude. She nodded slowly, smiled, and for the first time since I'd started seeing her, she looked peaceful. But as she began to fade from the mirror's surface, she pointed at me one last time, then at her own reflection, then made a gesture that sent chills through my entire body. She drew her finger across her throat, then pointed at the date on her wristwatch. March 15th. The same date she had carved into the wall 70 years ago. The same date she had died trying to expose the truth about Margaret Thorne's murder. Today's date. I left the mirror and walked quickly toward the exit. But the building's doors had locked automatically for the night. The electronic security system wouldn't disengage until 6 a.m., trapping me inside with whatever force had been trying to complete Rachel Morrison's unfinished business. As I turned back toward the mirror, I saw that my reflection had changed. I was still there, still wearing my modern scrubs, still looking like myself. But behind my image, the shadow Rachel was no longer alone. She was surrounded by 10 figures in hospital gowns, Margaret Thorne and the others who had died in 1953. They stood quietly, patiently, as if they had been waiting 70 years for someone to acknowledge their suffering and ensure their story was finally told. The mirror showed me my own face, but it also showed me my purpose. Some reflections reveal not just who we are, but who we are meant to become. And sometimes the most important care we can provide isn't for the living, but for those whose voices were silenced before they could speak their truth. I walked back to the mirror, pulled out my phone, and began documenting everything I had learned about Margaret Thorne and the others. Their story would be told, their deaths would be investigated, and their memory would be honored. Because some nursing duties extend beyond a single lifetime, and some patients wait decades for the care they truly need. The whispers started 3 weeks after I began working nights at Maplewood Manor, always coming from room 204. As a registered nurse with 12 years of experience, I'd learned to distinguish between the normal sounds of a healthcare facility and those that required investigation. The soft murmur of confused residents talking to themselves, the rustle of sheets as someone shifted position, the occasional cry for help from patients experiencing nightmares or disorientation. All of these were part of the nighttime routine. But the whispers from room 204 were different. They had a clarity and purpose that suggested lucid conversation rather than the rambling confusion common among our residents with dementia. Room 204 had been empty since my first night on the job. According to the charge nurse, the previous occupant had passed away peacefully in his sleep about a month earlier, and the room was being held pending deep cleaning and minor maintenance. The door remained closed, marked with a small placard indicating it was temporarily out of service. The whispers were barely audible, just loud enough to catch my attention as I passed during routine rounds. At first I assumed they were coming from adjacent rooms, voices carrying through the walls or vents. But when I checked the neighboring patients, I found them sleeping soundly, their rooms quiet except for the usual sounds of regulated breathing and medical equipment. By my second week, the whispers had become more distinct. I could make out individual words, though they seemed to be part of only one side of a conversation. Phrases like, "he needs to know" and "the family should understand" drifted through the door of room 204, spoken in the measured cadence of someone explaining something important to a listener I couldn't hear. What made my skin crawl was that the voice sounded familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have heard it before. During my third week, I decided to investigate more directly. I had the master key for maintenance purposes, and technically I was responsible for ensuring all areas of the facility remained secure during night hours. If someone had somehow gained unauthorized access to room 204, it was my duty to address the situation. The room was empty, just as it should have been. Hospital bed stripped down to the plastic mattress, nightstand cleared of personal items, bathroom cleaned and sanitized. The air carried the sharp scent of industrial disinfectant and the underlying mustiness that settles into unoccupied spaces. But as I stood in the doorway, I heard the whispers more clearly than ever. "William, you need to listen, William, my name." The voice was calling my name. I stepped into the room looking for any logical source of the sound. The ventilation system, perhaps, or some unusual acoustic effect from the building's structure. But the whispers seemed to originate from the space around the bed, as if someone were sitting on the edge of the mattress speaking directly to where a visitor might stand. "William Anderson, you look just like your grandfather." I froze. My grandfather had died when I was 12 years old, but people had often commented on our resemblance. The same broad shoulders, the same slightly crooked nose, the same tendency to furrow our brows when concentrating. "Grandpa Robert?" I whispered, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. The whispers paused, then resumed with what sounded like relief. "Finally, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. There are things you need to know, things the family never told you." Robert Anderson had been a quiet man, a veteran of World War II who'd worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local hospital for 30 years after the war. He'd died of a heart attack at age 74, and I'd always regretted that we hadn't had more time to talk about his experiences, his life, the stories that die with people when they pass. But this was impossible. I was a medical professional, trained in rational thinking and evidence-based decision-making. Dead people don't speak to their grandchildren through empty hospital rooms. "You're not hearing me," I said aloud, needing to establish some kind of rationality. "I'm experiencing auditory hallucinations, probably due to stress and irregular sleep patterns." The whispers became more insistent. "William, your mother never told you about my last job, did she? About where I worked those final 5 years before I retired?" My mother had always been vague about Grandpa Robert's employment history. I knew he'd worked at various hospitals and care facilities, but she'd never provided specific details. After his death, she'd mentioned that his last position had been at a private facility, but she'd seemed uncomfortable discussing it. "I worked here, William, at Maplewood Manor back when it was called Mercy General Hospital. I was the night maintenance supervisor from 1982 to 1987. The building had indeed been a hospital before its conversion to a nursing home. I'd seen historical photographs in the administrator's office, black and white images of the facility during its psychiatric care years. But I'd never connected it to my grandfather's employment history. Room 204 was where I died, William. Not at home like your mother told you. Right here, during my shift, trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed. I sat heavily in the room's single chair, mind reeling. My mother had always said Grandpa Robert died peacefully at home, found in his favorite armchair the next morning. She'd handled all the arrangements, had been very specific about keeping the funeral small and private. "What problem?" I asked, surprised by how easily I'd slipped into conversation with an empty room. "The patients weren't dying from their illnesses, William. Someone was helping them along, making their deaths look natural. I discovered the pattern, found evidence, but I confronted the wrong person." The whispers took on an urgent quality, as if my grandfather were running out of time to convey critical information. Dr. Marcus Webb was conducting experiments, testing drugs and procedures that weren't approved. He was using the psychiatric patients as subjects, and when they became too sick or too aware of what was happening, he made sure they didn't live long enough to report it. Dr. Marcus Webb. I'd seen that name on historical documents around the facility, memorial plaques honoring former staff physicians. He'd been well regarded, apparently, with a reputation for innovative psychiatric treatments. I had documentation, proof of what he was doing. But when I tried to turn it over to authorities, Dr. Webb convinced them I was having psychological problems. Said the stress of working nights in a psychiatric facility was making me paranoid, delusional. The familiar feeling of institutional gaslighting sent a chill through me. How many whistleblowers had been dismissed as mentally unstable rather than properly investigated? He gave me something, William. An injection while I was working alone in room 204. Made it look like a heart attack, just like he'd done with the patients. Your mother found my documentation after I died, but Dr. Webb convinced her that publicizing my delusions would only cause pain for the family. I thought about my mother's reluctance to discuss Grandpa Robert's final years, her insistence on a private funeral, her vague answers about his last job. She'd been protecting the family's reputation, preserving my grandfather's memory rather than pursuing justice for his murder. Where is the documentation now? I asked. Your mother hid it, but she never destroyed it. Too sentimental, too hopeful that someday someone would be able to use it properly. Check the basement of the old house, behind the water heater. Metal box wrapped in plastic. My mother still lived in the house where I'd grown up, the same house where my grandfather had lived during his final years. If his evidence was still there, it could finally expose the truth about Dr. Webb's crimes. But first, I needed to understand why I was hearing these whispers now. Why my grandfather was reaching out after 17 years of silence. Why now, Grandpa? Why are you telling me this now? The whispers became softer, sadder. Because Dr. Webb's methods never stopped, William. The techniques just got more sophisticated, harder to detect. Someone at this facility is continuing his work, using the elderly residents for unauthorized research. I thought about the unusual number of deaths we'd had in the past few months. All ruled natural causes, all involving residents who had been relatively stable before sudden declines. I'd attributed it to the normal risks of geriatric care, but what if there was a pattern I hadn't recognized? Who? I asked. Who's continuing Webb's work? But the whispers had stopped. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of building systems and the soft sounds of night shift routines in other parts of the facility. I sat in room 204 for another hour, hoping my grandfather would return with more information. When he didn't, I locked the room and finished my shift, my mind racing with implications and possibilities. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house and went straight to the basement. Behind the water heater, exactly where the whispers had directed me, I found a metal box wrapped in heavy plastic. Inside were patient files, incident reports, and photographs that documented a pattern of suspicious deaths at Mercy General Hospital between 1982 and 1987. My grandfather's evidence was thorough, methodical, and damning. Dr. Marcus Webb had indeed been using psychiatric patients for unauthorized drug trials, and when complications arose, he'd ensured the subjects didn't survive to report their experiences. But as I reviewed the documentation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The most recent entries in my grandfather's notes weren't about Dr. Webb at all. They were about a younger staff member who had been learning Webb's techniques, someone who had shown particular aptitude for making deaths appear natural. The name listed in those final notes was Dr. Emma Collins, the same Dr. Collins I worked with every night at Maplewood Manor. That evening, when I returned to work, I found myself watching Dr. Collins with new awareness. Her efficiency with terminal patients, her tendency to volunteer for difficult cases, her unusual success rate with residents who had been given end-of-life prognoses. Room 204 remained silent that night, but I understood now that some whispers aren't meant to provide comfort. Some voices from the past carry warnings about dangers that never truly ended, just evolved and adapted to new environments. My grandfather had died trying to expose Dr. Webb's crimes, but he'd failed to stop the broader network of medical professionals who saw vulnerable patients as opportunities rather than human beings, deserving care and dignity. The whispers had stopped because the message had been delivered. Now it was my responsibility to decide what to do with the knowledge, and whether I was willing to risk the same fate that had silenced my grandfather 17 years ago. Some family legacies aren't about property or traditions. Sometimes they're about unfinished business that passes from one generation to the next, waiting for someone with the courage to complete what their ancestors couldn't finish. The dispatch came in at 2:43 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, routine as any other late-night transport. Unit 47, we have a pickup at Riverside Gardens Assisted Living. 86-year-old female, stable condition, transfer to Maplewood Manor for specialized care. Patient is conscious and alert. I'd been driving ambulance for Mercy County EMS for 8 years, and I knew the route to Maplewood Manor like my own driveway. Riverside Gardens was a 20-minute drive on quiet roads, and Maplewood was another 15 minutes beyond that. Standard interfacility transfer, the kind of call that made up about 30% of our night shift workload. My partner Jake was new, only 6 weeks on the job, still nervous about patient care protocols and documentation requirements. He spent the drive to Riverside Gardens reviewing his checklist and asking questions about proper transfer procedures. I appreciated his thoroughness, even if his anxiety made him chatter more than necessary. The patient was named Dorothy Kellerman, and she was indeed conscious and alert, though she seemed confused about why she needed to be transferred. She was a small woman with bright blue eyes and silver hair pinned back in a neat bun, wearing a floral nightgown under the blanket we'd wrapped around her. "I don't understand why I can't stay at Riverside," she said as we loaded her stretcher into the ambulance. "I've been there for 3 years. The staff knows me, knows my routines. Sometimes specialized care requires different facilities," I explained, checking her IV line and monitoring equipment. "Maplewood Manor has excellent resources for whatever condition your doctor is concerned about." Dorothy studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You look familiar," she said. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so, ma'am. I transport a lot of patients, but I'm pretty good with faces. This is my first time meeting you." But as I said it, I felt a nagging uncertainty. There was something familiar about Dorothy Kellerman, though I couldn't place where I might have encountered her. The drive to Maplewood Manor was uneventful until we reached the facility's entrance. Instead of directing us to the main emergency entrance where transfers normally arrived, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio with different instructions. "Unit 47, proceed to the North Service entrance. Patient is assigned to Ward C, 3rd floor. Staff will meet you at the service elevator." I frowned. Maplewood Manor didn't have a Ward C. The facility was organized into wings, east, west, south, and north, with each wing spanning 3 floors. I'd been there hundreds of times and knew the layout thoroughly. "Are you sure about Ward C?" I radioed back. "I'm not familiar with that designation." Confirmed. Unit 47, Ward C, 3rd floor. Nurse supervisor will provide specific directions upon arrival. Jake looked at me questioningly. "Is there a Ward C?" "Not that I know of," I admitted. "But facilities sometimes reorganize, create specialized units. Maybe it's something new." We found the North Service entrance without difficulty, but when we arrived, something felt wrong. The area was dimly lit, with only a few security lights casting long shadows across the loading dock. Most interfacility transfers occurred at well-lit main entrances with clear signage and easy access for stretchers. A woman in scrubs emerged from the building as we unloaded Dorothy's stretcher. She introduced herself as Nurse Patricia Williams, but she was wearing a uniform style I hadn't seen in years, the old-fashioned white dress and cap that had been standard in the 1970s but had long since been replaced by modern scrubs. "Thank you for bringing Dorothy," Nurse Williams said. "We've been expecting her. Please follow me to Ward C." The service elevator was older than the main patient elevators, with manual controls and a gate that had to be pulled closed by hand. As we rose to the 3rd floor, I noticed that the floor indicator showed numbers I'd never seen before. Instead of the usual 1, 2, 3, the buttons were labeled B, 1, 2, C. 3 Ward C was between the 2nd and 3rd floors. The elevator stopped with a mechanical clunk, and Nurse Williams opened the gate. Beyond was a corridor that looked nothing like the rest of Maplewood Manor. The walls were painted an institutional green that belonged to hospitals from decades past, and the fluorescent fixtures cast a harsh, yellowish light that made everything look sickly and outdated. "This way," Nurse Williams said, leading us down the corridor. The rooms we passed were all occupied, but the patients looked wrong somehow. They were elderly, as expected in a nursing facility, but their clothes and hairstyles seemed to belong to different eras. Some wore hospital gowns that looked like they'd been issued in the 1960s. Others had clothing and accessories that suggested even earlier decades, and they were all staring at us as we passed. Not with the vague, unfocused gaze common among residents with dementia, but with sharp, intelligent attention. Their eyes followed our movement down the corridor, and several of them smiled or nodded as if they recognized us. Room C237, Nurse Williams announced, stopping at a door that looked identical to all the others. Dorothy, you'll be very comfortable here. The other residents are looking forward to meeting you. Dorothy had been quiet during the transfer, but now she gripped my arm with surprising strength. I know this place, she whispered. I've been here before. A long time ago. That's impossible, ma'am, I said gently. This is your first time at Maplewood Manor. No, she insisted. Not Maplewood Manor, this is Mercy General Hospital. I worked here in 1967 in the psychiatric ward. I was a nurse's aide on the night shift. Nurse Williams smiled. That's right, Dorothy. Welcome back. My blood went cold. Mercy General Hospital had been demolished in 1995 to make way for Maplewood Manor's construction. There was no way Dorothy could be returning to a workplace that no longer existed. But as I looked around Ward C, I began to notice details that supported her claim. The architecture was different from the rest of Maplewood Manor, older, more institutional. The room numbers were painted directly on the doors rather than displayed on modern placards. Even the smell was different, carrying the sharp medicinal odor of old hospital disinfectants rather than the gentler scents used in modern long-term care facilities. I need to get back to my truck, I told Jake. Complete the paperwork and get ready to leave. But when I tried to call the elevator, nothing happened. I pressed the button repeatedly, but there was no response. No indicator light showing that the elevator was coming. The elevator only runs when there are scheduled arrivals or departures, Nurse Williams explained. You'll need to wait until the next transport. When is that? Oh, it varies. Sometimes hours, sometimes days. But don't worry. Ward C has accommodations for staff who need to stay overnight. The implication was clear. We weren't leaving anytime soon. I looked at Jake, who had gone pale with realization. We were trapped in a part of a building that shouldn't exist, with patients who claimed to remember a hospital that had been torn down decades ago. Dorothy touched my arm again. Gary Miller, she said quietly. I remember now. You used to work here too, didn't you? Back in the early 1990s, just before they closed the hospital. You were an orderly on the night shift, but I'd never worked at Mercy General Hospital. I'd started my career in emergency medical services straight out of high school in 1998. 3 years after the hospital was demolished. I've never worked in a hospital, I said. You have me confused with someone else. Dorothy's expression became sad, sympathetic. The transition is hard for everyone, she said. It takes time to remember who you were before, to understand why you're here. We're here because we transported you from Riverside Gardens, I said, fighting rising panic. This is a routine patient transfer, is it? Dorothy asked. Think about it, Gary. When was the last time you remember leaving work? When was the last time you went home? I tried to recall driving home after my previous shift, but the memory felt vague, uncertain. Had I gone home yesterday? The day before? The harder I tried to remember, the more elusive the memories became. Jake was having the same problem. When did we start this shift? He asked me. I remember getting the dispatch, but I can't remember clocking in or getting the ambulance ready or anything before the dispatch. I finished. Nurse Williams nodded understandingly. It's always confusing at first, but you'll adjust, just like everyone else does. Ward C exists for people who died while working in healthcare facilities. You continue doing what you always did, caring for patients, but now you're part of the facility permanently. The truth hit me like a physical blow. I remembered now. Not leaving work, but the chest pain that had started during my shift. The crushing sensation that had dropped me to my knees beside the ambulance. Jake trying to perform CPR, the other paramedics working frantically to save me. We'd died during our shift, and somehow, we'd been assigned to continue working in a part of the healthcare system that existed beyond life and death. The patients in Ward C, I asked. They're all former healthcare workers, Nurse Williams confirmed. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, technicians, anyone who died while caring for others. Death doesn't end the calling to help people. It just relocates the assignment. I looked down the corridor at the residents who had been watching us so intently. Now I understood their expressions. They weren't confused elderly patients. They were colleagues, fellow healthcare workers who had found themselves in the same situation we now faced. Dorothy squeezed my hand. It's not so bad, Gary. The work is meaningful, and you never have to worry about going home to an empty apartment or dealing with administrative hassles. You just care for patients, like you always did. Jake was crying quietly, probably thinking about the life he'd left behind, the family who would mourn his death. But I felt something unexpected, a sense of peace. Healthcare had been my calling in life, and apparently it would be my calling in whatever came after. What kind of patients do we care for here? I asked. The ones who need it most, Nurse Williams replied. People who are transitioning between life and death, who need comfort and guidance during their journey. It's the most important work you'll ever do. As she led us to our new quarters, I realized that some ambulance runs don't end with a return to base. Some transfers take you to destinations that aren't marked on any map, places where the work of caring continues long after the traditional shift has ended. And sometimes, the most forgotten wards are the ones where the most essential care is provided by staff who understand that healing is a calling that transcends even death itself.